Welcome to Pursue Wisdom, the teaching podcast of Bethlehem Church in Austin, Minnesota. I'm Pastor Paul Steele, and we are in a sermon series called Asking for a Friend. We all have questions when it comes to God, the Bible, what it means to follow Jesus. And we would like some answers to those questions to give us confidence in what we believe. And so my prayer is that in this sermon series, you will be encouraged, that you will be given some reasons on why you can know that following Jesus is the absolute best way to live. Let's get into the sermon.
So we are continuing this series, Asking for a Friend, as we deal with questions that people have about God, the Bible, and what it means to follow Jesus. And this morning is the second sermon that deals with culturally controversial subjects. And just like I talked about last week, our goal in entering into these types of conversations isn't necessarily to persuade everyone else, to win a debate with the world, but rather it's to represent Jesus well. That we bear God's image and we want to live in such a way that brings honor and glory to Him. And so that is our goal. And the question we're looking at today is, what is the definition of marriage? What is the definition of marriage? In the evening, we have, as a family, been watching some older TV shows. So we've watched all the seasons of the Brady Bunch, all the seasons of Different Strokes, and now we are on Family Matters. And this past Friday, I was thinking about, how do I introduce this sermon? I had an idea of what I wanted to say, but I hadn't found it yet. And then we were watching on Friday night, and I'm like, oh, this is it. This is exactly what I've been looking for. So in Family Matters, remember, this is the show where Urkel is kind of the main character, but there's the Winslow family. And you have Harriet, the mom, her sister Rachel, Laura, who's the daughter, and then Carl Winslow's mom, Estelle, Mother Winslow. And at the beginning of the show, they come home from attending a baby shower. And Rachel says, man, I don't know what I'm going to get her next month for her wedding shower. And then Mother Winslow says this. She said, I miss the days when people had their showers in the right order. And I just was blown away, because here's a show that aired in April of 1992, as I was looking forward to high school graduation 31 years ago to be exact. And at least superficially, right, the culture still assumed that marriage would precede having kids. So much has changed in these last 30 years. So much has changed in the last 30 years. Now, right? Actually, I was just thinking about this. It wasn't very long after that where you had the controversy. Do you remember this? The controversy on Murphy Brown, because Murphy decided that she could have a child without being married. She didn't need to have a family. She could just raise a child on her own. And that was a big kind of scandal. That was a big part of the news cycle there for a while. So much has changed, and culturally we are just kind of confused when it comes to marriage. And so I was looking at some news reports, and I came across these different marriages that just show how confused we are when it comes to marriage. So I found two instances where women married themselves. Like, I can't find anybody else out there, and I love myself, so I'm just going to marry myself. Like, what does that even mean, right? I found one instance, and I'm not really for sure if this is satire or not, where a woman married a rag doll. I found another instance where a woman married a 100-year-old chandelier named Lumiere. I found several instances where people married their dogs. Now, that's the culture, that's the world that we live in, because we've convinced ourselves that the most important thing about marriage is love. Well, if I love someone or I love this thing, then I can declare my lifelong commitment to it or to them. And love, all you need is love. Right? Love is love. That becomes the most important thing with marriage. Marriage has always been a crucial aspect of human civilization. You can look around the world and throughout history, and marriage has always played an important role. And the reason for that is that the family is the foundation for any healthy nation. You need to have family, and family begins with marriage. And so marriage has always been honored throughout cultures, throughout history. And yet we find ourselves in this very peculiar time in world history where we're like, well, what is marriage exactly? In 1977, I found this definition in Webster's Collegiate Dictionary on what marriage is. Marriage is the institution whereby men and women are joined in a special kind of social and legal dependence for the purpose of founding and maintaining a family. Now, you can tell by the words there that definition had been there for a while. Like, Webster just decided, like, hey, all these definitions are good, we'll just stick with them. And so that was the definition of marriage. Looking at Webster's definition of marriage in 2023, it reads, there's a lot of similarities, but you can probably guess the difference. Instead of stating that marriage is between men and women, it just simply says marriage is between two people. From a Christian point of view, marriage is not primarily about a social or legal reality. That's what these definitions deal with. That marriage is a social thing, it's a cultural thing, it's a legal thing. But from a Christian point of view, marriage is not primarily social, it's not primarily legal. From a Christian point of view, marriage is primarily religious, where marriage is a commitment made before and with God for it's a commitment made before and with God, and that means that our understanding of marriage needs to start where? In the Bible. In the word that God gives to us. While there are many different passages that we can look at when it comes to studying marriage and what that means in the Bible, we're going to look at what Jesus taught about marriage. In Matthew chapter 19, verses 3 through 12, Jesus was asked this question, and it was meant to trap him about divorce. And as Jesus answers this question about the primary threat to the sacredness of marriage within his culture, we're going to be able to understand the truth that we need to help us understand what marriage is about in our culture, in our setting, in our reality. So let's take a look again here at Matthew chapter 19, verses 3 through 12. Some Pharisees came and tried to trap him with this question: should a man be allowed to divorce his wife for just any reason? Haven't you read the scriptures? Jesus replied. They record that from the beginning God made them male and female. And he said, this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. Since they are no longer two, but one, let no one split apart what God has joined together. Then, why did Moses say in the law that a man could give his wife a written notice of divorce and send her away? They asked. Jesus replied, Moses permitted divorce only as a concession to your hard hearts, but it was not what God had originally intended. I tell you this, whoever divorces his wife and marries someone else commits adultery, unless his wife has been unfaithful. Jesus' disciples then said to him, if this is the case, it's better not to marry. Not everyone can accept this statement, Jesus said. Only those whom God helps. Some are born as eunuchs, some have been made eunuchs by others, and some choose not to marry for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can. So in this passage, we discover three parts of Jesus' teaching about marriage that are going to help us come up with a proper view, a biblical view, God's view on what marriage is all about. And so first, the first part here is the Pharisees' question in verses 3 through 6. Some Pharisees came and tried to trap him with this question: should a man be allowed to divorce his wife for just any reason? Haven't you read the scriptures? Jesus replied. They record from the beginning that from the beginning God made them male and female. And he said, this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. Since they are no longer two, but one, let no one split apart what God has joined together. So Jesus responded to this question about the lawfulness of divorce and what should the grounds of divorce be. Not by going to Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4, which talk about this concession that Moses gives to Israel about divorce. Rather, Jesus goes all the way back to Genesis. He is going to remind the Pharisees of why there is marriage in the first place. And this was done because most Jews of that time thought that the ideals that were put into place at the beginning foreshadowed the future of God's kingdom. So what God intended from the beginning, that's how it's going to be in the kingdom. So it's important to know, what was God's ideal? What was God's original plan? And so Jesus quotes from Genesis chapter 1, verse 27 that we looked at last week when we talked about gender, that God created them male and female. He says that there are two types of humans. There are the males and there are females. This is a crucial, important information, Jesus says, when it comes to understanding what marriage is all about. There are males and there are females. He then connects this with Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, which actually would have activated in the mind of these Pharisees and all those who were listening to him the entire story. Because Jesus says, for this reason. What reason? So in Genesis chapter 2, you see that God places in the desert, in this arid conditions, a garden that he irrigates with rivers. And in the middle of this garden, he places man. And he gives the man a job to do. He is to tend this garden. And that word tend should get us to think two things. It should get us to think about a gardener working in the garden, obviously, and it should get us thinking about a priest working in the temple. It's that word. He is to tend the garden. He's to work in God's temple. He's also to protect it. So there might be some bad things on the outside that the man is supposed to keep out. But God sees that and hey, it's not good for him to be all alone in trying to do this task. So God brings in or creates these animals to come and to help him. We shouldn't think here that God brings him all the animals, just animals that might be helpful, and he names them, showing that he has authority over them. But what happens is that the man realizes that, hey, there is no suitable helper for me in this task. And that he is all alone, like all these other animals kind of come two by two, but I'm just by myself. So God causes the man to go into a sleep. And here, it gets a little weird. Most translations, because of the way the Hebrew says, what the Hebrew actually says, will say, and God took from his side. And so our imagination is that God takes it takes a rib because that's from his side. Actually, the Hebrew says that he takes his side. Probably the better understanding here is kind of visualizing the man being split in two, taking the side of the man, which makes a whole lot more sense now. Hey, the two are united back into one. So God creates a helper. And that word helper, again, does not mean somebody who is less than, a servant of. In fact, the only other person that word helper is attributed to is God himself. So the woman and the man are to work together in the garden to tend to it, to care for it, and to expand it out into the world. That is what they are to do. And then the writer of Genesis says, this is the reason, and this is what Jesus quotes, this is the reason why a man leaves his family and is joined to his wife. And the two will become one flesh, which isn't just a euphemism for sex. It's actually pointing to family. You're my flesh and blood. So it's from the union of the two, of the male and the female, where children come from, new flesh come from. And so that's all within what Jesus said when he quotes those two passages from Genesis. It's pointing all the way back to Genesis. And according to Jesus, this union between man and woman, between husband and wife, is a gift from God. And you should think twice. So there's this warning here that you should think twice about splitting up anything that God has brought together. So Jesus lays out, here is the ideal for marriage. This is what God intended from the very beginning. This is what marriage looks like. Now, we go on, and the second part here is the disciples' response. Verses 7 through 10. Then why did Moses say in the law that a man could give his wife a written notice of divorce and send her away? They asked. So the Pharisees asked this question. Why then did Moses say it was okay to get divorced? Jesus replied, Moses permitted divorce only as a concession to your hard hearts, but it was not what God had originally intended. And I tell you this, whoever divorces his wife and marries someone else commits adultery unless his wife has been unfaithful. Verse 10, Jesus' disciples then said to him, if this is the case, it's better not to marry. That was the disciples' response. Man, if that's the case, it's better not even to get married. So here we have the Pharisees doubling down. Like, okay, why did Moses give us this concession of divorce? And what Jesus says is that divorce is a concession because of your hard hearts, because you're sinful. That's the reason, because there has to be a way out when marriage is bad, when abuse happens, when there is unfair treatment happening, when infidelity happens, when the marriage covenant is broken. Now, Jesus focuses on adultery. But that's not the only thing that breaks the marriage covenant. And so Jesus says this is the reason why there is allowed divorce. Because that's not God's original plan. God's original plan was for marriage to be between one man and one woman for the rest of their lives. But you live in a sinful world, and sometimes people do dumb things, sinful things, and the best solution to that is not to keep people in a situation that hurts, that's abusive. And so divorce was allowed to happen. Now, isn't it interesting then? And so what was happening is that at least some Jewish men were serial monogamists. In other words, they were fine with monogamy within marriage until for some reason they wanted someone different. And so the two extremes on this divorce question was, one was divorce was only permitted for sexual immorality, for adultery. The other end was, oh, you can get divorced for any reason the man wants. She burns your toast, you can get rid of her. Like, those were the two extremes. And in a culture where the woman has no rights, nothing, that put the woman at a very big disadvantage. I want you to think here, just kind of on a little side note, about the woman at the well. We look at her as a sinful person. She was a woman that got tossed aside time and time and time again until her only option was to live with a man who was not her husband. Like we put our own prejudice and bias and says, hey, she's an adulterer who's just shacking up with all these. No, that's not what, she couldn't divorce any of those. She was tossed to the side. So by Jesus saying, this is, God's plan here is lifelong commitment, and the only legitimate reason for divorce is this, is he's trying to protect women from just being tossed aside. Because, again, in that culture, why are you going to marry somebody who's already been married? Her value starts to go down. So there's a lot of pain associated with this, and Jesus is saying, hey, you need to honor your commitment here. This is for the rest of your life. Marriage is a lifelong commitment. And so to enter into it, right, because the disciples, even the disciples are saying, man, if this is the case, if this is for the rest of my life, then it's better not to marry. We have people, that's what our culture says. We're probably only going to get divorced anyway. Divorce rate is 50%, so why even bother with that? We'll just live together. We don't need that commitment. Better not even to get married. Marriage is a lifelong commitment, so count the cost and go into it truly committed to the part until death do us part. That's what Jesus wants us to remember to think about before getting married. The third part here is Jesus' teaching on celibacy. Matthew chapter 19, verses 11 through 12. Not everyone can accept this statement, Jesus said. Only those whom God helps. Some are born as eunuchs, some have been made eunuchs by others, and some choose not to marry for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can. Notice that Jesus doesn't try to convince the disciples how wonderful marriage should be, so you should go ahead and get married. Not what Jesus does. He agrees with their statement. What? That blows our perception of what marriage is away. Jesus says, yeah, it's better not for you to get married. If you can't make this commitment, marriage is not the end goal. Marriage doesn't complete you. Right? You're not some lesser person because you're not married. Jesus says, yeah, you're right. It's better not to get married. Except, here's the problem. Most people can't handle that. There's some who can. There are those who are born, Jesus says, as eunuchs, or people who just, for whatever reason, can't have children, can't, have sex or whatever. And they're born that way. There's others who have been made eunuchs. And then there's others who, because of their faith, because of their commitment to the God, says, I am not going to get married because I'm going to focus on my time and my energy on God's kingdom. In fact, Paul will say that about marriage. Like, hey, if you can handle it, don't get married. Because once you get married, your focus is going to be divided between the kingdom of God and your family. And so I think it's crucial for us to think through what Jesus is saying here. Because sometimes we in the church can elevate marriage to such a high status that we make all single people like second-class citizens. Where in the early church, it was just the opposite. In the early church, it was if you were single, hey, you had this high calling from God. You had this high calling from God. So you don't need to be married. You're not incomplete if you're not married. You're not failing your purpose if you're not married. Remaining single, according to the Apostle Paul, allows you the time and the focus to dedicate on the work of the kingdom, but only a few people are able to actually handle this calling. And one reason why we don't need to pursue marriage in order to live out God's call on our life is because ever since Adam and Eve, people have not been alone. There are people around us that we can join with to do the work of the kingdom. And that means that for us who are married, need to make room in our lives for those who are not, and offer them companionship, and offer them friendship, and offer them ways to join us in the work that we're doing. We don't need to be married because we're not alone. So, as we look at these three parts of what Jesus taught, I think from there that we can arrive at three truths that help us today as we come to a proper definition of marriage. And the first is marriage is sacred. God created marriage, and we need to hold it as sacred. Paul, or the writer of Hebrews, in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4 says, "Give honor to marriage and remain faithful to one another in marriage. God will surely judge people who are immoral and those who commit adultery." We are to honor marriage, and a key part of that is keeping sexual intimacy where it belongs. And marriage, no matter what else the culture might say is acceptable, in the church, as Christians, we need to honor Jesus' view, God's view of marriage. And part of that is keeping the marriage bed sacred. That as Christians we believe, and this is so crucial for us, and it's something that I think as the church in the United States we've left and we've forgotten about and we don't talk enough about. That sex is reserved for marriage. That's where it belongs. Anytime sex is outside of marriage, it's wrong. We are called to be a chaste people. We don't participate in sexual immorality before marriage, and we're completely faithful within marriage. The physician Galen, who was the best-known physician in the Roman Empire, wrote about Christianity, and he said the two things that made Christians distinct are their belief in the resurrection and being chaste. Would that be said about the church in the United States today? That one of our things that make us distinct from the world around us is our chasteness. It's our chastity. And so we hold marriage as sacred because it's a gift from God. Marriage, the second important truth is marriage is between a man and a woman. It represents the two types of human, male and female, becoming one. And this is crucial. Remember, this is from last week. This is where last week's kind of ties in with this week, is that God created us as sexually dimorphic, which means, right, that it takes the sperm of the male and the egg of the female to create new life. And marriage becomes the environment for families, for children, and that can only happen with male and female. And so marriage is between a man and between a woman. And the third truth is marriage is a lifelong commitment. Marriage is a lifelong commitment. What is needed is not just romantic love, because romantic love comes and goes. It's one of the reasons why we have no-fault divorce. Because if you marry for love and all of a sudden you fall out of love for one another, there's no other reason that you guys can't get along with one another. You have to have some way out. And so you have no-fault divorce. Nobody has to prove anything. It's just like, oh, we don't love each other anymore, so we can dissolve this commitment. No, what we need is Hesed love, covenant love, a love that is going to make a commitment to one another for the rest of our lives. That is what's needed. That we are committing ourselves to one another. And that's why the most important part of any marriage ceremonies are the vows. And they need to be vows. So often I find in marriages and wedding ceremonies are that the vows are no longer vows, they're declarations of love for one another. We need those vows. This is what I promise to do for you. The only problem is that we no longer have any mechanism to hold people accountable to those vows. Again, with no-fault divorce, you can go ahead and get divorced. Even if there's no infidelity, even if there's no abuse, even though if the marriage covenant has not been broken. And we're kind of powerless to hold people accountable to these vows that they've made, but may be well assured that God knows what's going on. And if you've made those vows to Him, before Him, He will one day hold you accountable to those. Jesus' teaching on marriage emphasizes the importance of commitment and the sacredness of marriage covenant. Marriage is a lifelong commitment, and any divorce that happens should be approached with great caution. We must strive to uphold the sanctity of marriage and be willing to make the necessary sacrifices to maintain our commitments. You don't need to be married to become the person God created you to be. Right? Again, this is going back to it's okay to be single. What you need to be, like all of us, is to be faithful to Jesus. So here's our big idea, and this is kind of my definition of marriage, whether you want to accept it or not. This is it. Marriage is a lifelong love commitment between a man and a woman to represent God in this world together. And so in our premarital counseling that Jenny and I do with people who wanting to get married, this is what I'll tell them, is that when you come together, you become a dynamic duo for the kingdom of God. That's what this is all about. This isn't just about, hey, let's join our lives together. No, this is a commitment you're making because you want to bring God's kingdom into this world. That just like Adam and Eve were put in that garden to tend it, to care for it, to expand it, that marriage is meant for that same purpose for the kingdom of God. You become a dynamic duo for the kingdom of God. And so the best way for us to share this definition is not to plaster it all over the place, it's to actually live it. Because the number one problem with marriage today is not the progressive left or this or that. It is because God's people in the United States have not lived out God's definition of marriage for ourselves. And so we need that commitment to live the way that God wants us to live. And that's how we're going to defend marriage in this world by actually living it for ourselves. So here's the challenge. Our challenge is this: pray for the church in the United States to return to a proper understanding of marriage. That it's not enough just to say marriage is between one man and one woman. No, marriage is about the commitment of a man and a woman to come together for the purpose of God's kingdom. And realizing that that is the foundation, that commitment to join our lives for God's kingdom, that is the most important thing. God's idea of marriage is under attack. And to defend it, it starts with the church. Christians need to reject the world's definitions for marriage and accept God's definition. Marriage is one of the best ways for us to demonstrate God's character in this world. And our loving commitment in marriage and our faithfulness to God outside of marriage both represent God in this world. Our commitment inside of marriage and our faithfulness outside represent God in this world.
We don't have to worry about the questions that we may have. God's not afraid of them. There are good answers to the questions that we have. And I am confident that as we seek these answers, God is going to use the whole process to strengthen our faith and make us into the people that He created us to be. Keep on asking those questions and keep on looking to God.